Excellent. Hi, everyone. We are giving folks just a couple of minutes to jump on. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to present the third part of our 6-part series on PWN's policy agenda. If you have missed the past ones, you can go on to PWN's website, PWN-USA.org. I really encourage you to take time to check it out. It's a really good way to lay the groundwork for what we'll be talking about today, and you can learn more about important topics like ending criminalization and universal health care. While we're giving folks time to jump on, I'll just run through some logistics for you. Everybody is joining by the computer or phone is going to start on mute. If you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat box or into the question and answer section. And we're going to be monitoring that to ensure that no one's questions get lost. So then at the end of the webinar, when we have 20 minutes for questions and answers, you can ask whatever you want then. Additionally, if you want to hold and wait until the end, we're going to have time for verbal question and answers. So make sure you're writing down your questions and you can raise your hand and I will take you off mute at that time. Okay. So I think we'll give folks about 2 more minutes to join. Thank you everyone for hopping on. I'm very much looking forward to talking about advancing economic justice for women living with HIV. And we have an expert panel waiting for you. So I know you're excited as well. Okay, I think we will get started. So as I said before, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 3rd part of PWN-USA's Policy Agenda webinar series. Our topic today is going to be advancing economic justice for women living with HIV. I'm very excited. We have some special guests here today. You're going to hear more about them as we move forward. As I'd mentioned, everybody joining by computer or phone starts on mute. And if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, which we will be monitoring, or you can hold off until the end, at which time you can raise your hand and I will unmute you when we're doing the question and answer section so that you can ask your question to our panelists on your own. Today you will have 2 moderators. My name is Kelly Flannery. I'm the If, When, How Reproductive Justice HIV Fellow with Positive Women's Network, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Also on the line with us is Brianna Diaz, our new Policy Director at Positive Women's Network USA. Her pronouns are also she, her, hers. And I will turn it over to Brianna to introduce our panelists.
Awesome, thanks Kelly. So today we have the distinct privilege to have Mark Misrok. Mark Misrok is a member of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus and Executive Director of the National Working Positive Coalition. Mark worked for 12 years running and developing the Positive Resource Center Employment Services Program for people living with HIV, beginning in the program as a client and then a volunteer. The National Working Positive Coalition works on national, regional, state, local, and agency levels to increase and improve employment opportunities for people living with or are greater vulnerability to HIV through training and technical assistance, advocacy, and research. We also have Toni Michelle Williams. Toni Michelle Williams is the director of the Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative and serves on the leadership team to the Racial Justice Action Center in Atlanta, Georgia. She is an Atlanta native, strategist, and master facilitator for Black LGBTQIA communities, generative somatics practitioner, and teacher, healer, performance artist, and co-leading the #Snap for Freedom movement in Atlanta. In 2015, she launched the Atlanta Trans Leadership Internship Program, a 4-month program centering the leadership of Black trans folks in Atlanta. Toni Michelle brings laughter, joy, and music to spaces, and she brings a desire to learn more, practice more, and grow so that she can be the most whole and powerful leader that she can be. And finally, we have Preston Van Vliet. Preston is a white pansexual transgender man who is HIV negative. He has been an organizer of family values at work for 4 years, working at state and national levels to pass paid leave policies that cover chosen family relationships. He was a case manager for a permanent supportive housing program and was a PATH outreach worker before this job. Preston is a harm reductionist at heart and works to bridge the paid leave movement with communities that use drugs and communities that engage in sex work. So we're happy to have y'all.
Thank you.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk a bit about what Positive Women's Network is. So the Positive Women's Network USA is a national membership body of women and people of trans experience living with HIV and are allies that exist to strengthen the strategic power of all women living with HIV in the U.S. We were founded in 2008 by 28 diverse women leaders living with HIV. And PWN-USA develops a leadership pipeline and policy agenda that applies a gender lens, a racial justice lens, an economic justice lens to the domestic HIV epidemic grounded in social justice and human rights. Okay. So why are we having this webinar? How did we get here? Why is this one of our policy concerns? Well, after the 2016 election, PWN went through an intensive process taking stock of the emerging needs of our members and broader consistency in order to help guide our advocacy well beyond this administration. It is clear that we were and are facing grave and increased threats to our health, human rights, and safety. In the midst of dangerous regressive policy attacks on the state and federal levels, we have been fighting hard to maintain those policies that help protect our survival. But we also recognize that we needed to do more than hold the line. We needed to think forward beyond what's politically possible right now because we won't be here forever. So PWN uses as an opportunity to think about building new systems of power and pushing for progressive policy change that meets our needs holistically and equitably. So PWN spent over a year taking leadership from women and people of trans experience living with HIV and taking stock of the emerging issues that our members, that impact our members most, and using listening session participants told us most impacted their ability to live full, healthy lives with dignity and bodily autonomy. Do I actually get a drum roll? No. Yeah, that's okay. I'll keep going. So through this process, we developed our policy agenda buckets and fashioned our updated policy priorities. Our 6 policy priority areas are ending criminalization, universal health care, economic justice, sexual and reproductive health, rights and justice, ending violence against women living with HIV, and trans rights, safety, and justice. This webinar series will introduce you to each of these 6 buckets, and we will do a deep dive into each priority area with experts in the field in order to provide you with the context and information you need to engage in these issues in a way that is grounded in, what, like I said, racial justice, gender justice, and reproductive justice.
Great. And so for our webinar today, we have 3 main objectives. Those are to increase understanding of attacks on economic security and the potential impact that those attacks have on our communities. We're going to learn about policies that can help ensure that we can meet our daily needs and support ourselves with dignity, I'll say. And we'll also learn about how that organizing does work. We're going to highlight policy solutions and actions that you can take to advance economic justice in your community with those advocates that you love. Okay. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about PWN's policy agenda. We had a great introduction to what it is and why we formed it from Brianna, but the point of this webinar is to really dig into economic justice. So in the economic justice section of our policy agenda, you're going to find our vision. It's that all women and people of trans experience who are living with HIV are fully supported and prepared to participate in the workforce in the ways that they choose, where there's no negative employment or economic consequences related to health status, sex, gender identity, or gender expression. There's no negative employment or economic consequences because of family responsibilities, because of race or ethnicity. Now, I'm going to give you all on the line right now a huge spoiler alert. We are not there yet, right? We are not meeting PWN's vision. We don't have the necessary structures, public programs, or protections to ensure that folks can meet their daily needs and support themselves and their loved ones. In fact, right now, what we're seeing is the opposite. We have gaps in important policy protections, and what that's done is created an environment where, depending on where you live, employers can deny employees affordable comprehensive health insurance coverage. They cannot offer paid sick, safe, and family leave, and they can actively discriminate against people because of their health status, gender identity, or experience with the criminal legal system. People of trans experience face persistent gender-based discrimination, surveillance, and hypercriminalization that contribute to higher rates of unemployment and poverty. And the effects of that are amplified for people of color. Being unable to find or hold a job or having a criminal record can erect insurmountable barriers to accessing essential safety net services like food assistance, cash assistance, or subsidized housing. And we see under these income eligibility gaps for life-sustaining programs, such as the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, ADAP, some medical care services and housing programs mean that people living with HIV are forced to keep their incomes below a certain level in order to maintain access to life-saving medication, stable housing, and other services. As a result, people who try to earn more for themselves and their loved ones can be penalized or even excluded from care. But you should take heart because our policy agenda is not all bad. We also have some concrete solutions to state, federal, and local actors to advance economic justice. So I've pulled a couple of our recommendations out onto the screen so you can see them, but you're also going to find them on our webinar. So you see, we recommend things like strengthening employment discrimination protections for people of trans experience, advancing employment opportunities for people living with HIV, and we oppose adding a citizenship question on the 2020 census. Throughout the course of this webinar, you're going to hear more from our expert panelists about what these policies are and why it's so important to push for change. Okay. So in addition, along with each of these webinars, we've actually created some resources for you so that you can take a fact sheet, print it out, and start activating for economic justice in your community. And so what you're going to see on you can see our new economic justice fact sheet. I've pulled out some screenshots so you can look at it, but you can also just go to the link below and check it out for yourself. In this fact sheet, we deliberately focus on protecting the social safety net to protect access to food, housing, healthcare, and other essentials for people living with HIV. The social safety net is a vast array of publicly funded programs and services that aim to ensure that people can meet their basic human needs. We know that a robust social safety net can reduce food insufficiency and unmet medical needs, it can advance racial and gender equity, and it can help lift people out of poverty. Really here, when we talk about the social safety net is a really appropriate metaphor, right? The social safety net is there. It's supposed to catch people when they fall on hard times. And we also know that in the US, that social safety net is full of holes. So this fact sheet is going to give you some information about some of those holes. In particular, we dig into Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP, or food stamps is what we used to call it. And it highlights dangerous policies that do things like require people to document that they've worked a certain number of hours, so-called work requirements, to receive benefits. The Department of Health and Human Services has approved Medicaid work requirements in 8 states, and 7 have applications pending. We know that these work requirements increase coverage gaps and reverse some of the progress that's been made under the ACA. In some states, like Alabama, work requirements actually constitute a really cruel catch-22. A parent or caretaker who works enough to satisfy the work requirement would actually earn too much to qualify for Medicaid. Overall, at least 25 states have tried to impose work or drug testing requirements, time limits, enrollment caps, and restrictions based on immigration status to stop essential programs from reaching those who need them most. Just like in our policy agenda, in our fact sheet, we propose solutions. We recommend opposing cuts to housing, food, and healthcare programs, repealing or rejecting work requirements in drug testing and SNAP, Medicaid, and other essential programs, and eliminating the federal benefits ban for people convicted of drug felonies. There are other recommendations as well, and I encourage you to check it out. We also have a long list of resources that are available to folks who want to do a deeper dive into the social safety net. So now that I have gone over a little bit of some of the resources that you'll have after this webinar, I'm going to just turn it over. So right now, I would love to hand the reins over to Mark, so I'm going to stop my sharing and hand it over.
Thanks, Kelly. Can you see the slides, my slides? Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you, but I'm not seeing your slides.
Okay. Didn't transfer over the way it did right before the meeting started.
Okay. Would it be helpful for me to share my slides?
Sure, if that would, yeah, I don't see why it's not showing up, but if you could, that would be great.
Absolutely. So let's do present. There we go. And you can just give me a heads up when you would like me to switch.
That's great. Kelly, thank you so much. Kelly and Brianna, thank you so much. Hearing that absolutely gorgeous economic justice vision of PWN is just a fresh reminder of what essential, invaluable work that PWN has done from its beginning, and how grateful I am for it personally, and appreciative I am to be invited to be a part of this webinar. I am going to talk about some of the cost of our history of disregarding economic justice, almost entirely outside of PWN's work. In the HIV policy world, we see a very pervasive pattern of disregard of economic justice to a very large extent. There's been some small projects that are often locally based where there's been some great work, but I just want to say that it's exceptional that this focus is created by PWN, and it's a source of long time frustration for those of us who frequently come in contact with the struggle and suffering that so many people experience in the difficulty in living with HIV and feeling trapped in poverty. Next slide, please. What we do know is that there's tremendous intersectionality in HIV and employment. When we look at the factors fueling the HIV epidemic, when we look at racism, the misogyny and transphobia, homophobia, the classism, the anti-disability, anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, the decades of mass incarceration, we're very clear that these are factors that have fueled an epidemic in this country, and they're also entirely related to the struggle that so many of us have faced in confronting the work world. The folks who are most impacted by HIV, who suffer the poorest health outcomes, who continue to be impacted by high transmission rates of HIV, are communities that have historically faced an unequal playing field in the work world and in economic opportunity. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about what the context is at the federal level in terms of federal policy and federal funding. What we know, what we all know, I think, is that the HIV care clinical and supportive services system is overwhelmingly shaped by the policies and funding that come out of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services through the HIV/AIDS Bureau of the Health Resources and Services Administration. That's the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. And what many people don't know is that the legislation underpinning the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program has since the 90s disallowed the use of that funding for employment services. And so in these decades where we have seen tremendous improvement in our health, quality of health, our life expectancy, and our functionality as people living with HIV, especially when we are able to access health care and treatment, we continue to see that the services that we rely on the most, the folks who know us the best and arguably care about us the most, are unable to address employment needs and services. The only allowance under Ryan White for anything that might be employment related is under the non-medical case management funding allowance. The non-medical case managers are allowed to discuss employment and refer people to employment programs in their community if they know about them, if they understand how to effectively and meaningfully identify employment needs and suggest appropriate referrals based on what individuals need and want. There has been little to no history of training of service providers in that system on how to understand employment needs and opportunities of people living with HIV, the issues and barriers that we frequently face, and strategies to reduce the barriers to employment for many of us. There is also an allowance of funding for benefit specialists, which have historically primarily been funded to assist people who really needed help to gain disability benefits and other benefits that were essential to staying housed, to staying basically economically stable. And they can also, and they're also essentially important to help people who may gain access to health coverage through benefits programs. And these folks can also be among the experts who can translate the very confusing and complicated information in the policies of these programs for what does happen when your income changes due to work earnings. Now, also in the HIV-specific federal funding streams are the HOPWA programs under HUD. The Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS program now does allow use of HOPWA funds for employment services. So it's been relatively newly emerging in the last several years, and there's now beginning to be a network of agencies that have started to request and receive funds that have created in some communities the first ever HIV-specific employment services. And I just want to say that I've always heard that the rationale for such limitation to use of HIV-specific funds to address employment needs has been because of the awareness of the huge federal programs to address the needs of job seekers and workers in general. What we have now got many decades of data to see and experience to learn from is that people living with HIV show up in disproportionately low numbers in the mainstream workforce development and vocational rehabilitation programs. And there's been no incentives to those agencies to make any changes in their delivery of services and planning of programs to play a role in addressing the employment needs and the economic justice goals for people living with HIV. And so I think many folks on the call may be similarly familiar with how many folks we know who struggle for access to accurate current information about what happens to my benefits. Where could I even get help if I want to try to prepare for work? What are the opportunities that may exist in the community that may make sense for me to pursue, and how can I prepare for them? So there is a tremendous policy need from all of us to apply pressure to the programs that exist to address not only our clinical needs, but the social determinants of health, which do include poverty, unemployment, and underemployment across our communities. Next slide, please. What we see and hear about regularly is that service providers really have a limited knowledge base for entering into discussions with the people they work with about their employment interests, their needs, their concerns, their barriers, and the resources that may exist and the service responses that may be effective to address those needs and interests. And we really have rarely seen the public and community-based employment programs, the workforce development, the vocational rehabilitation programs that together are about a $25 billion chunk of the federal budget. They've rarely been connected to HIV services, HIV care, and supportive service delivery. And they absolutely do need training on HIV. Many of them have very outdated understanding about HIV and living with HIV and people most impacted by HIV, and they need to be informed and updated and trained to be prepared to effectively serve people living with HIV. Next slide, please. Change is needed in, change is needed in the worst way to the policies of our benefits programs regarding work and access to information and assistance for well-informed decisions. I want to emphasize this phrase, well-informed decisions. I find too rarely are we really equipped to make well-informed decisions about our economic futures, our economic realities, our access to employment opportunity. Too few of the work incentive policies actually are structured to allow for the kind of realistic incremental pathways to employment with a living wage that would make sense and support the health and well-being of people living with HIV and our families. There is painfully inadequate access to information and advisement related to the existing benefits program policies, and there is frequently opportunity that's misunderstood or not known in terms of opportunity for folks to make transition into employment or into a different employment situation while safeguarding their best interest and maintaining their housing and their income stability and their access to health coverage. But too few people actually have somewhere to go to get help with access to this information and get assistance in really understanding the complexities of the policies of these programs. So here's what I see regularly. I see folks who say, you know what, I can't stand this anymore. I'm just gonna take this job and see what happens. Or I see people who say, you know what, I've been having this feeling that I would be better off if I could work for years now, but I feel like I'm at risk of ruining my life if I do it, and I don't understand how I can do it. And so it's now been year after year after year that I haven't been involved in activities, been involved in services and accessing resources that might help me make a transition into a different phase of my life. So I feel very stuck and suffer in the limitations of my circumstances. There needs to be, number one, comprehensive online access across all of this country to information about benefits programs and their so-called work incentive policies. And that's currently only available in a handful of states through a website called db101.org. I hope that many of you take a look at it. I think that it's a model for what should be available for all of us, no matter where we live. It's created on a state-by-state basis because the policies do vary and the realities do vary from state to state. And so there needs to be that kind of specificity. I think if you take a look at this site to understand some of the bones of the policies and the potential of such a site for your state, I'd recommend looking at the California site on DB 101. DB 101 stands for Disability Benefits 101. And I live for the day when there is a similar access to really accessible information on the benefits and the benefits policies for all people living with HIV and other disabilities. Next page, please. Next slide, please. I want to talk through some of what I would recommend to be understood as guiding principles and values in the consideration of initiatives to address employment needs of people living with HIV, and indeed to encourage consideration of employment among people living with HIV who may not be employed or may be considering changes in their employment status. Number one, first and foremost, there has to be respect and value and prioritization of self-determination in decision-making and well-informed choice of people living with HIV and employment-related decision-making and service participation. And there has to be inclusion and input of people living with HIV at all steps and levels of employment initiatives, their development and collaborations. Collaboration is essential among both public and community-based programs until the day that we have the ideal economic structures and ideal government and ideal programs that we need to work hard to get in place. I strongly recommend that we apply energy and focus and attention to squeezing all of the juice that we can out of what exists. And I will say in all honesty that when it comes to employment, there are tremendous resources at the national, state, and local levels that have barely been tapped to benefit people living with HIV. I also strongly recommend that there be a high value on the utilization of trauma-informed approaches in employment-related service delivery. In our communities, there are high rates of experience and impacts of trauma. And for many folks, that can be a tremendous barrier in itself to succeeding in preparing for employment, for gaining and maintaining the employment that folks might most want to have. Next slide, please. Institutional mistrust is a dynamic that we are very familiar with from the beginning of this epidemic for very good reasons, for historical reasons, related to the pervasive racism, homophobia, transphobia across our communities, across our country, top to bottom, left to right, and it has served in itself as a barrier to successful access of healthcare and treatment, and it is paralleled in the workforce development and vocational rehabilitation world. And so there'd be what I personally understand is how this has contributed to low levels of trust and exploration of the community partners who may offer employment services by HIV service providers, who may well feel that they are protecting people living with HIV, but also there's reasonable skepticism and wariness among us, among people living with HIV, about walking into a state agency or walking into any community-based employment program. Will I be someone who feels like I'm really a priority in this agency? And that's absolutely true across many of the communities most impacted by HIV. Employment training and education service systems need ongoing system-wide, and I mean from security guard up front to the director, training to provide and to be prepared to provide effective, non-stigmatizing, affirming, welcoming, and trauma-informed services to all people living with HIV. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I know that in many parts of the country, there has already been, or there is currently in development, what many term an ending the epidemic plan at state and local levels. And I had the opportunity to participate in the development of one of the first in New York State, where I live. And one of its 30 blueprint action items was one that was entitled Increase Access to Opportunities for Employment and Employment/Vocational Services. And I think this is critically important, and the inclusion of an item like this in these plans for many folks brings onto the radar screen for the first time ever that maybe we should be paying attention to whether folks need work, whether they need help with work, whether we should be involved in building our capacity to identify these needs and respond to them. Next slide, please. This really is a guiding principle. People living with the HIV need to be equipped to make our own well-informed decisions about employment. We hear these horror stories of the number of states who are looking for opportunities to slip in these work requirement policies to programs that we would rely on for access to health care, to food and nutrition security, to housing. These are tragic. These are truly terrible, painfully and potentially death-causing policies that we have to fight with everything that we have in us. And at the same time, it is truly terrible and painfully misguided for us to continue to be reluctant to develop access to the employment information and services and resources that people want and need when they are seeking and interested in employment and need information to make decisions about whether to pursue employment, whether it's in their best interest, and what strategies could possibly work for them. We really need to have access to accessible, and what I mean by accessible is information that's in language that works for us to understand it, and actionable information on the full range of employment, training, education, benefits, and legal programs and services that could be available to us. I would disclose that my own personal vocational rehabilitation process has relied on all of those components of what I think are an essential network of services and resources for many of us. I needed to have benefits counseling. I needed to have legal services to address some legal barriers. I needed to have training and education, and I needed to have skilled and supportive and competent and affirming employment services to make change in my life. And I feel this is essential to be made available to all of us. Legal rights and protections against all forms of discrimination. Again, too few of us have access to information and knowledge about the rights and protections we may have, or what we can fight for that may be in development. And protections regarding HIV status disclosure, rights to reasonable accommodations in the workplace. For some folks, understanding what we have a right to under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, may unlock our sense of potential for engaging in work that we'd want to do. And we need help and assistance to understand and strategize to maximize the benefits that we are reliant on when we're working, or transition from benefits to employment, and as well when we need to transition from employment to benefits. Next slide, please.
Thanks so much. Mark, I just want to flag that we do need to move on to the next presenter relatively soon. So if you could just wrap up relatively quickly. Thank you.
I sure will. Why don't I wrap up with this slide? We need to update our policies and collaboration to support access to employment opportunities for people living with HIV. And what I mean is that we need to push for change in SSI, SSDI, Medicaid, Medicare, HOPWA, ADAP, and here in New York City, HASA, as among the key benefits programs that folks rely on that have policies that are either functioning as a disincentive to employment and an escape from poverty, or have policies that are not transparent to us. We certainly need to promote ban the box and other legislation to reverse the devastating impacts of mass incarceration and criminalization on economic and employment opportunity for communities impacted by HIV. And legal protections need to be passed so that from one coast to the other, throughout all the states and territories, there are legal protections for folks who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary in the workplace. And I think my personal information is the next slide. Yes, so I'll also post it in the chat in case anybody wants to follow up with me directly for questions or input about any successes in your area in addressing employment needs of people living with HIV. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I really hope we get to, during the question and answer section, maybe talk a little bit more about the sort of informational gatekeeping that you brought up, and especially, and also like the intersection of economic justice and mass incarceration, I think is a really important point as well. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn us over to Toni Michelle.
Hey everybody, how are you today? Thank you so much for having me. I just want to start off by giving some appreciations and love and light to PWN for all of your amazing work. I was introduced to PWN last year and got a chance to kind of flaunt my leadership wings when there was a breakdown in the leadership retreat. And in that moment, I really understood kind of what my power or position was in this movement in relationships to leadership development as it relates to directly impacted folks and women living with HIV and Black trans folks who are in this work with all of us. And so what I'm offering today is really, I was asked to highlight some of the amazing work that some of our partners and experts in the field are doing, and that continues to move folks who are living with HIV and folks who are engaging in sex work and other folks who are directly impacted by criminalization toward economic justice and equity. So I'm going to share with y'all a few stories of the many Black trans women in our network and in our body of work in Atlanta who are the experts of our own lives and how they have been establishing and creating and cultivating economic justice right at home in our communities. You can go to the next slide. It's a little bit about me. You heard a lot about me, so we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So I am the director of the Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative. Our collaborative is a Black, trans, and queer-led collaborative that really builds power of Black trans folks, queer folks, and all of our folks, like I said, who are facing and who are surviving and who are fighting against the injustices that we face every day through the system, through our families and other like interpersonal things. You can go to the next slide. Some of our collaborators you may know well. Misty Chamblee of Legender is a collaborator who was also a person who introduced me to PWN. Shout out to Miss Dee Dee. along with Transforming, which is an organization dedicated to Black, trans, masculine folks. Women on the Rise is the organization for Black women that are inclusive of Black trans folks and trans women who are really leading the campaign and work of formerly incarcerated women, and the Racial Justice Action Center. And together, through all of our collaborations over the past 5 years, we've offered solutions to Atlanta and solutions to community and some of that work has included decriminalizing marijuana or deprioritizing arrests for marijuana offenses under 1 ounce in the city of Atlanta. It has also been in offering solutions around the pre-arrest diversion initiative, which is how we all started collaborating in the first place. Back in 2013, the city of Atlanta wanted to banish a group of people who were engaging in sex work. And when those folks who I just mentioned came together, we realized that they were attacking Black trans women who were engaging in sex work. And Mark talked a little bit about some of like the implications of trauma and honestly the importance of how we practice working and building across identities. And so a lot of our work, again, has been a part of leadership development. And with that, we created the Snap for Freedom School back in 2017. So, which is a hub for folks who are directly impacted to come in and get the leadership that is required to sustain us in this work. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to back up a little bit and kind of still stay into like what we do. And what I want to offer, a big piece outside of the leadership and development models and the campaigns that we lead, we really are committed to activating the leadership of Black, trans, and queer and gender non-binary folks in Atlanta. In that we are committed to embodying and modeling qualities of leadership that has like guided us through our campaign work. And our work is related to this conversation around economic justice because it's grounded in one of our major principles. And that principle is our belief in what it takes to take care of our own. Taking care of our own, the principle really acknowledges and attempts to provide the solution to one of our biggest barriers and challenges in transformative organizing, which is really how do we sustain ourselves in community and within our organizations. I want to take a deep breath and slow down. Yes. If you don't mind going to the next slide, and I'm going to ask you to go back. And I apologize, Kelly. Perfect. Could you hear me? If you can go to the next slide, then we'll come back. Bam. Then one more slide. Yes. So, 1 second. So, yes, asking these questions about how do we sustain ourselves as community and as organizations when we're all out here trying to survive, right, in an economy that doesn't want us or that isn't created for us to survive or thrive in that, right? And 2, how do we come back the spirit or energy of survival, right? When we all long for and are committed to reimagining a world where women and folks living with HIV are fully supported and prepared to participate in the workplace in the ways that we choose. And Mark hinted to that around how are we holding space for the ways that people are showing up in their trauma and their responses when indeed or in fact that the folks who are directly impacted oftentimes haven't served in leadership positions. And so I want to talk a little bit about what are the things that economic justice kind of force us to ask. If you can go to the next slide. Beautiful. EJ forced us to ask, what are we choosing, right? When you're thinking, and I'm coming from a place again, talking about developing leadership with Black trans women who've never had jobs before, right? Folks who are living with HIV, who are struggling with mental health, who are navigating medications that may alter their body in the ways, again, that they can show up in the workplace, right? Again, when we're talking about economic justice, what are we choosing? And who are we choosing? And even in that, who are we choosing to save, right? And most importantly, how are we choosing to collaborate and share and build within this framework? Mark hit that as well, right? Collaboration is so key and so important to advancing economic equity and justice within vulnerable communities. And we've learned over 5 years, how can people join us at City Hall, right? We talk about implementing policies or fighting for policies that liberate us as directly impacted folks. But how can they show up? How can we show up at City Hall if we don't have the things we need, right? How can we take over the streets of Atlanta like we did in 2017 in the March for the Girls, which was protests in response to the murders of 3 Black trans women in New Orleans, where we demanded an end to killing Black trans folks. Like, how would they be able to show up? And it was a struggle. How would they be able to show up without the money to pay for their hormones in order to pump through the city, feeling powerful, right, and capable of such an action? How can we move past the ways that we are reactionary also in our work, as we are like offering emergency support to our people and who are and actually developing systems and pipelines that maintain stable enough lives for our people who are the experts to not just survive, but thrive in, right? And what does that look like as they're participating in the work that we are creating together and cultivating for each other that will transform our communities and transform the world. We know that transforming economic power is not just about law and policy, right? It is as much about collectivization and community building and work that is really heavily gendered. And for so many of us, again, the advocates and organizers who are literally on the ground, who are coming from backgrounds like myself of being a former sex worker, how violent this work could be and how re-traumatizing the work could be for us, and how that also leads to burnout. Also, I believe that, or we believe that a focus on the everyday and like ordinary forms of resistance and negotiation can provide like extremely powerful insights in how we are individually and collectively working to secure our own rights and developing our own economic systems. We've seen this, right, in the ways that sex workers be. When I was engaging in sex work, and when I support girls who are engaging in sex work now, I remember hiding in bathrooms. I hid in bathrooms with pepper spray, sometimes knives, so that when the date comes in, whoever I'm sharing space with, whoever, if it's a best friend, if it's like my trans mom, she's able to come in the bathroom, throw me the money, I can keep the money, keep it safe, and also just to also stay present in order to, if anything happens. I wanted to hit a point around self-determination. Mark also touched on it a little bit, but it is a critical part of economic empowerment. When we again think about economic savings amongst sex workers, how that can avoid us taking more risks when we need emergency funds or when we need support from the state in order to be safe, or when we need support from our communities in order to be safe. And so Black trans folks in Atlanta and our allies have really been in that work over the past 5 years, really, again, committing to and studying the processes in which we engage folks who are directly impacted in policy work, in creating and building foundations and structures that support our sustainability, not just in finances, but again, in organizations and in community. I think it's really important to acknowledge some of the rhetoric that is actually in y'all's fact sheet, in PWN's fact sheet, just around a few challenges that folks living with HIV, and particularly Black trans women, are experiencing as it relates to violence. Misty Chamblee tells an amazing and brilliant story. She makes brilliant connections around her life living with HIV and what it has meant for her and her safety and how she's moved through poverty. One thing that PW mentions in the fact sheet is how people living with HIV are incentivized to stay poor. Ms. Didi also talks about that and also in incentives of folks remaining sick, right? And Ms. Didi talks about that a lot. She often talks about, her thinking to catch HIV or to get HIV or to obtain the virus just so that she can have somewhere to stay. And if these are mentalities and if these are circumstances that our folks are suffering through and dealing with individually, these are also the types of barriers that are preventing them, again, to have agency and ownership, number one, over their bodies, but also over their finances. And so the question that I want to leave y'all with, of course, is, again, how do we become more powerful to take leadership in developing and stabilizing our own economy? And with that, we encourage at SNAPCO through our Snap for Freedom School and through our program called ATL, which is a program specifically for Black trans leaders in Atlanta. We encourage them to be bold, creative, authentic, and transformative in their leadership. And that takes a few skills and that takes a few qualities. And so I would just leave y'all today with a few qualities of embodied leadership or emotional intelligence that is required as we make commitments and keep dreaming and scheming and reimagining a world where we have economic equity and justice. And so when working with your folks who are directly impacted, it's so important for you to be able to assess organizations and individuals, to assess, our leaders and their reliability, right? We want folks to be able to center, to be grounded and present with not just the work, but with their struggles and with their traumas. So that when we are in collaboration with each other and we are developing systems and growing together, that we are accountable to each other and dependable. That there is qualities of mutual connection and deep listening. That there are also qualities of being able to give and receive assessments or feedback. That is so critical. Last year at the Leadership Summit, one of the things when the breakdown happened, and folks who are on the webinar, if you remember, when the breakdown happened, there were so many cis women, and to give you context, there was just like weird energy around the inclusion of Black trans women in the space. And of course, we know that as we are building across identities, these are shared struggles and conversations that we should be in before we even enter the work, right? And so I'm hoping that my offerings here today and what I'm leaving you with now is kind of grounding you in that. And one thing was that folks, cis women in particular, struggled with some assessments. And some of those and just giving and making offerings to, again, how the ways in which their thinking or their philosophies or the ways that they've had to survive will impact other people. And again, as we are committing to collaborating and developing leaders that allow us to grow and build, assessments are so necessary, right? Being clear, another quality of leadership as we are developing together is allyship, right? Kind of staying in that same ballpark around assessments. It's so important that we trust each other and know what it means to be able to fight for each other and how to keep each other safe. Also entering when things feel uncomfortable and being uncomfortable, being comfortable with what's discomforting to us. And lastly, surrendering. I think that one of the biggest parts about collaboration, what doesn't work or have not worked in our movement so far, is the spirit of ego. And what follows that sometimes is also like a spirit of pettiness, if you want to just use regular old language, right? And how that kind of, those qualities don't serve us in our fight for unity and in our reimagining of how collaboration could liberate us. I'll just lastly leave us with this kind of qualities that we've been building in Atlanta amongst Black women who are living with HIV, specifically Black trans women, have led us to some amazing collaborations. I'm going to name two, which is Toya Washington, who was an intern in our second cohort of ATL, who started her own oil company, body cream and body oils and fragrance company called Lait en Farouche. And through our program, through building her embodied presence, through really her practicing those being in those qualities and living out loud in those qualities that I just shared with you, she's able to hire Black trans women to support her in her business. She's also able to hire Black queer men and other queer folks who support her, who are supporting her in this journey of entrepreneurship and economic development for herself. Lastly, Janelle Black, who was a graduate of our 2017 Snap for Freedom School, who last year just launched a clothing line called Fish Line, again, that was created by and for Black trans folks to feel empowered about the clothes that we wear, and just knowing, and so just sharing those stories of success, because it is, sharing those stories of success because it's truly grounded in what it means to build courageous, bold, authentic, and emotionally intelligent leaders. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And I hope that we'll get to talk more about like the difficulty to not just be reactionary and to really like build that courage, because it's hard to do. So I hope we can talk more about that in the question and answer. And with that said, I know we're pushing a little bit behind, but Preston, I'm gonna give you your 15 minutes and then we're just gonna cut questions down to probably about 15.
And I'm down. I can probably shave off a couple of minutes because I feel like Ms. Toni Michelle and Mark touched upon a lot of the value statements and big questions that we should ask ourselves when talking about economic justice. So thank you, PWN, the other presenters on the call. I'm very excited to be talking with you all today. This is my third time doing a presentation for Positive Women's Network about the role of paid sick and safe days and paid family and medical leave, and the importance of how we define family for people living with HIV. So I'm very excited. Thank you all so much. So I'm with an organization called Family Values at Work. We're a network of 27 state organizations that are trying and winning paid sick and safe days and paid family medical leave at local and state levels. And I'm going to be talking about some of those ways that people can get involved, and like what this means for women living with HIV and their families. Next slide, please. I like putting in little GIFs at the end. This is like my favorite motivational verb right here. This is how I try to get through the day. Anyways, next slide. So yes, next slide. I might skim through these, as many folks have talked about the importance of intersectional analysis when thinking about what is like the unique way that people living with HIV are impacted by economic justice, and what does economic justice look like. So I created this Venn diagram of overlapping racial justice, gender justice, disability, and economic justice. And like right in the overlap of all those four, you'll find folks with a particular set of experiences of ways that the system has intentionally failed them. And so a lot of folks who engage in sex work, who use drugs, who are HIV positive, who have experience with the criminal justice system, homelessness, who have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, fit into that little area of overlapping circles. And as we know, so many people who are HIV positive have literally experienced all these things. And so thinking about economic justice, we have to make sure that we are understanding and addressing, and as Toni Michelle was saying, make sure that those most impacted are leading the solutions and the process for what economic justice looks like for them. Next slide, please. Like Ms. Toni Michelle did, asking yourself questions is sort of a way to help pull out like what is most important to be thinking about. And for Family Values at Work, we take the approach of also thinking about the historical context. So we focus largely on like caregiving. Caregiving is sort of like the also an overlay of those four circles when thinking about who has been forced to give or who has been exploited for their labor over time, who has experienced longstanding exclusion and violence, and whose needs are actively being ignored. Starting, the beginning of like when the US was discovered, and recognizing that the roots of slavery and genocide have created the systems of white supremacy that continue today and are continuing to harm communities of color today. And that includes the caregiving that women of color and Native women were forced to give to white imperialists. That's part of our economic history in this country, and something we need to recognize as still impacting economic justice for communities today. Next slide. Similarly, who is considered family has been shaped by a white upper class supremacist culture, the nuclear family, and this gets to what, again, Toni Michelle was saying as well about communities coming together to take care of each other, and the ways in which government programming has excluded the ways like that people are forming meaningful relationships with each other. Next slide. It was really exciting that like SNAPCO is on, because one of the projects that my organization has supported was this typical Georgia families photo exhibit that like a bunch of groups actually came together to put on, where there was these like beautiful photography exhibit showing all different kinds of families, chosen families, queer families, multi-generational families, mixed status documentation families, and took this sort of like show on the road. First it was at the state capitol in Georgia, and then they did sort of like a series of 3 or 4 community events, bringing together a bunch of different service providers to talk about how current policies can leave out all these different types of families. Next slide. So my question, and how Family Values at Work tries to approach economic justice, is how do we shift from individual well-being to collective well-being, understanding that like health and caregiving are really like what we need to keep in mind when thinking about economic justice in this country. Next slide, please. So I have a bias towards what are some current policy avenues folks can take to be addressing this shift to more collective well-being. And one of those ways, next slide, is talking about paid leave policies. What I want to sort of say up front about these both paid sick and safe days, paid family medical leave, is that it's they're for the most part benefits that people can only access if they're in the formal economy, which, as Mark was discussing, has its challenges for people who are navigating keeping their disability and accessing other programs at the same time. And what I offer is that this is not the catch-all solution to any of the employment challenges that folks who are most impacted by HIV are facing, that we need to acknowledge, as both Toni, Michelle, and Mark had said, the self-determination of people living with HIV and the type of employment that they want to have. So understanding that people go through different types of things in their lives where they are engaging in sex work, that's the thing that fits their schedule the best, that fits their ability the best, it's the thing that makes the most sense to them at that time, and that is awesome. And this doesn't necessarily support you when you're engaging in sex work directly. We need to be finding more economic justice solutions through the policy lens that does support the health and well-being of people engaging in sex work while they're on their job. This can help cover some of the caregiving supports that someone who's engaging in sex work may be able to access. Like, for example, if you have a formerly employed sibling or cousin, or just like someone who's part of your trans family does have like a part-time or full-time like formal employed job, and they get paid sick and safe days, they can help you access going to the doctors, you know, and taking care of yourself if you're sick and not able to work. So those are like a couple of different ways that I'm trying to think about the role of like a formerly employed person who may be able to access these paid leave policies. Again, by no means is it everything we need, but it's a step in the right direction. So to talk a little bit about the difference between these two buckets of policies, we have paid sick and safe days, which you think about for like shorter increments of time, like if you need to go to a doctor's appointment, or if you have the flu for a few days, and you have you're part of like a formally employed job, or your loved one has access to a formally employed job. It's just to take care of like short illnesses, routine health care, and that kind of thing. Safe days, which is of particular, I think, importance to like women living with HIV, is pertaining to like if you are experiencing a domestic violence situation, you can also use the paid time that you're getting through this policy to, you know, go to a DV shelter, to go to, if you choose to, try to get a PPO against your abuser. You could use it for other things related to seeking safety and shelter. And knowing that, especially like when women living with HIV disclose their HIV status to partners, that like incidents of domestic violence go way up because of the stigma and violence that those communities face. This is something that we have been trying to focus on, making sure our paid leave policies are including, recognizing that the stigma is real and causes violence still. Next slide. So we have had a lot of success in passing paid sick day laws in the country. So it said it on the previous slide how many there are, but there's a lot. Please look at this list and see if your state is covered or not. Feel free to, A Better Balance is a great resource and organizational partner that we work with on these issues. They have a great website. This is where I got that from. Next slide. The other policy bucket that we work on is paid family and medical leave. And this is what you think of when you think of like maternity leave or paternity leave. It's that longer length of leave, and usually you don't get like 100% of your wage replacement, but you get like a high amount. And so this is not just to bond with like a new baby, but it could be to bond with a foster kid or an adoptive kid, again, which could be relevant to women living with HIV and the families that they're building and that they choose to build. It could be used for your own self-care, and it could be used to take care of a loved one who is really sick. Next slide, please. These are the 7 states in which we have one of those policies, and there is actually a really exciting federal campaign right now to try to get one nationally. Next slide. When we talk about the importance of inclusive family definitions for these communities, again, there's this historical context of which families are excluded because of like the white supremacist patriarchal culture, and then like what are the like policy impacts that this has when we think about caregiving supports for those communities. Next slide. This is basically the way that I think about it, is like, who gives you a ride? Who's there to take care of your kid when you when something unexpected comes up? And you know, when you think about historically folks living with HIV, you know, who was there to take care of you when you were dying, when, you know, your biological family abandoned you? And that caregiving is such a like deeply rooted value within queer communities, trans communities, and people living with HIV, that like needing to have an inclusive family definition is very pertinent, so that we can like Ms. Toni Michelle was saying, show up and take care of each other. Next slide. And then this is me with some of my chosen family at my queer friend's wedding, having a great time. These are people who I have taken care of and who have taken care of me. And I don't know, I think we all have those special people in our lives who we may not be legally or biologically related to, that, you know, we would drop everything at the hat to take care of. And that should be valued in our society, to take care of each other like that. Next slide. This is a really great quote from a Native American counselor during the Duluth, Minnesota Paid Sick and Safe Day campaign, about how in tribal communities an inclusive family definition is really important. And this is something that we're trying to be doing more of as well. There's a really pertinent Indian Child Welfare Act SCOTUS thing happening now that's would really destroy Native communities' abilities to keep Native kids like with their tribe. So just wanted to raise that as another issue around like foster care and family definition. Next slide. So we have some really great paid leave laws that do have the most inclusive definition of family. They're listed right here. You can also email me if you have questions. Next slide. And as I said, there are really awesome federal campaigns, both for paid sick and safe days and paid family leave, that are happening right now, both trying to have the most inclusive definition of family as possible. So if you're interested, next slide, email me, Preston at Family Values at Work. And then next slide, just because it's really cute. It's a fat cat that says, I love you. Okay, I didn't save any time. I went exactly 15 minutes. I'm sorry.
That was amazing. It was worth the 15 minutes. Thank you so much. And I would love to talk more. You know, you've had a lot of successes with your campaign. So like, if you could like give folks some tips on how those successes came about, that would be amazing. But before we turn to my questions, Brianna has been monitoring the chat box. Do we have any questions in there?
Unmute. Okay, unmute. Looks like not at the moment.
Okay, well, for everyone who is listening now, if you just put up your hand, I can unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question to any of our presenters. So please go ahead and raise your hand. While we are waiting for folks to do that, Brianna, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so I really like the piece where, Mark, you were talking about how gatekeeping has kind of prohibited information and access to any sort of advocacy going on or prioritizing our issues. So I was wondering if you could expand more about that, any experience you have or advice in how we can avoid that kind of behavior in our advocacy work.
Well, let me make sure I understand your question. When you're referring to the gatekeeping dynamic, do you mean that the folks who may be dominating the HIV policy agenda at the national level or program design, either from the federal agencies? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
And so I'm sorry. So you were asking me just to talk more about that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, it's been from my very specific focus on employment, which I came into because I desperately needed help with employment. And I was lucky to find it from an agency that barely found an ability to sustain itself, coupling together resources. And it certainly wasn't encouraged to come into existence or be maintained by the federal, state, and initially not the local level HIV services policy or programmatic systems. What I understand is that sometimes I think there's really a paternalism that can be at play, and folks sort of thinking they may know what's best for other folks, or making decisions about what people may be capable of. As a longtime employment specialist, I have regularly heard service providers, certainly not all, but sometimes heard service providers describe the community of people that they serve as people who are not capable of work or are not interested in work or maybe haven't worked. And it takes very little exploration to discover that they're referring to people that include folks who have had all kinds of work experience and skills and credentials and training and education. There have been times when I've spoken to folks who work in homelessness and housing services who have sometimes used made comments somewhat similar to that. And I know that housing shelters and housing programs include folks who have had all kinds of experience. And even if it may not have all been what's considered formal employment, there's a very frequent dynamic of folks not understanding the very real skill and talents that people have utilized in work, such as sex work or other forms of employment that aren't recognized and protected as more legal and governmentally sanctioned forms of employment. What I see recently is that for very real reasons, people have been profoundly concerned about the threats represented by the proposals to impose work requirements on very basic essential services that folks need. And I think that for some folks who don't know a lot about employment or don't know a lot about the employment needs or experiences of people living with HIV, I think that sometimes folks will gently steer the conversation away from employment out of fear that shining a light in that area might inflame a damaging policy development related to work requirements, and not feel confident in our ability to differentiate the provision of employment services to people when they need and want them and request them and define what they need and want, as opposed to imposing work requirements on people to get health coverage or food and nutrition. Those are some examples that come to my mind. I don't know if that's helpful or very precisely answers your question.
No, that was perfect. We actually have another question from one of our attendees. The question is, good afternoon, everyone. My question is about women living with HIV and fair employment with fair wages, no matter what area of employment or age of a person. I am over 40 and female African-American woman living with HIV with an MBA and BFA, and I'm having difficulty finding employment in my interest. What are your tips for people like me? So we can just, the panelists can just popcorn.
This is Preston. Like what Toni Michelle was saying with some of the folks who have been through SNAPCO's program, like start your own business. Learn how to make your own LLC and see what resources might be in your area to help you get that started, knowing that it can be, the paperwork's hard and there can be upfront costs about it. Also think about looking into some of these like national advocacy positions too. Actually, some of them, you can work anywhere in the country and do your gig, which is actually what I've been able to do. And I'm sure all of us would be happy to help look at your resume and see what we can do to support you.
I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate both Preston and Toni Michelle highlighting becoming your own boss, being self-employed, starting a small business or a micro enterprise as what might absolutely be in the best interest for some folks. And they're definitely, and so I kind of regret in my slides that I didn't include that as a value, because I think sometimes in employment initiatives, people forget that folks may be capable of and want and succeed and potentially be best off with the opportunity to get support and assistance and resources to be able to develop work that they do into their own self-employment. For the potential of exploring what access to employment for this woman who wrote the question, I don't think it says anything specifically about where she's sought help, but I would entirely recommend discovering exactly what does exist in your community, including these government programs or community-based programs that are typically outside. We've caused Toni Michelle to drive away. Oh my goodness, I just noticed that. I'm so sorry, Toni Michelle. I want to just highlight two systems, and I should have probably included it in my slides, but there's two federally funded systems that get a gazillion dollars a year that can have some resources that can really make a difference for folks, especially when folks either inform themselves about exactly how they work and what the resources are that they can offer, or if our advocates and service providers inform themselves and develop the capacity to assist us, which is what I want to see everywhere. Until there are the programs in every community and even in every agency that actually are tailored to the folks that we are working to extend economic justice to, I really encourage folks to take a look at the state vocational rehabilitation system. They're in every community, so anyone who might qualify based on one or more disabilities or chronic health conditions would be eligible potentially for a lot of resources, and that can include help in starting a small business. But also through the workforce development system, there's a network of what are federally called American Job Centers, which are workforce development career centers or hubs, workforce development hubs in communities everywhere in every state and in every territory and in DC. And so these finding where your local offices are is something that can be done through Googling, or if you contact me, I'd be happy to help anyone to find what exists within an accessible range of where you live. I would absolutely try to squeeze what can be valuable and helpful to you out of those public programs, and also do a little landscape survey of what community-based employment programs may exist in your community. Sometimes just down the street, you might not have known it.
Thank you so much. So I know that we are almost at time, and what I would love to do to sort of end this out, I have one more slide that it'll have registration for other webinars, but I want to hear from each of our panelists. So we talked a little bit about the difficulty of really not just being reactive when we have all of these assaults on our rights and basic dignity in order to like thrive and survive in our best and live our best lives, but really being like proactive and progressive in our thoughts. And you know, our panelists have seen successes, so I would love to hear just from each of you sort of maybe like your one best tip to be the most successful advocate for economic justice. It's a lot.
I feel like I've talked too much. So I want to let other folks talk first, but I have a recommendation. Should I just throw it out there? I would say it would be to inform yourself about what's currently in place and inform yourself about the legislation that's getting proposed to make changes in the system that may improve policies that are in place or create policies that are needed. There's certainly a lot of information online, and in terms of employment specifically, I do feel like there's a need for us to step outside of the HIV services world to look at what can sometimes initially seem like musty government programs that actually contain some folks who are great allies of ours, some folks who maybe aren't so wonderful, but if we can find and connect with the folks who are really anxious to have the resources that they're connected to gain meaning in our communities, you could potentially make transformational change in your community. And I would say that it's been a great surprise and pleasure amongst the frustration of my work in this field to discover that whether it's Mississippi, Indiana, California, New York, Oregon, in locations where you have no idea if you're going to find some valuable resources, that there's some great people buried in these government programs that you might be able to liberate to be able to have more beneficial impact for our communities.
Thank you, Mark. And I'll just add, just briefly, just remember that, you know, we can't do this by ourselves. We can't do this alone. And knowing that you can either. And so my offering again is to honor kind of what I shared with you all today was just to commit to your personal own transformation. And be in shared principle struggle with folks that are in this work with you, who are building with you, so that you can be held accountable. And sometimes and oftentimes with accountability comes transformation and change and really a pathway to the other side of what we're all trying to reimagine, and what we're all hoping for and longing for. So stay true to your personal transformation, and be open to the transformation of folks around you.
Yeah, thank you, Toni Michelle. And I would say both at a personal level and within my own organization, sharing resources with like oppressed folks. Like every time I get a raise, I'm just, you know, paying, I'm becoming almost like an employer myself. I'm just like, who needs money? Who needs a gig? I got a raise, here you go, sharing it around, but also holding my own organization accountable to supporting in solidarity other groups so that they can come together more. For example, we've supported a couple of trans leadership development like camps in Montana. We are trying to support bringing together indigenous leaders, and we're just sort of giving them money to just like meet up together, get to know each other better so they can build their own capacity together. So think about the ways, take risks, try out new ideas. When you get resources, share the resources.
Thank you so much. So that's it. We will be having, these are some of the resources. You'll see this on the resources sheet is going to be on the actual fact sheet that PWN is releasing. You can also find our policy agenda and our new fact sheet online. We do have 3 more webinars coming up: Ending Violence Against Women Living with HIV, Advancing Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights and Justice, and Advancing Trans Rights, Safety, and Justice. You can register for them all right now, so I hope that you will. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to our amazing presenters. This was absolutely fantastic, and I love leaving webinars so much more informed and empowered than I feel like I came to them, so thank you for that. And I hope that everyone has a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and I will stop recording.
Bye, you guys.